The late afternoon sun painted long golden streaks across Willow Creek Park, stretching the shadows of trees like fingers reaching for something unseen. Laughter echoed through the crisp autumn air, carefree, light, full of life. The playground teemed with movement. Children scrambled up ladders, swung from monkey bars, chased one another in dizzying circles. The air smelled of fresh-cut grass, damp earth, and the lingering sweetness of melting ice cream cones. A little girl squealed in delight as she jumped into a pile of freshly raked leaves, sending a burst of orange and brown fluttering through the air like confetti. Parents sat on nearby benches, chatting, occasionally calling out warnings to their children. But Hazel Murphy sat apart from it all, motionless, silent. Her hands rested on the cool, worn armrests of her wheelchair, fingers lightly curled but unmoving. She wasn't watching the other kids. Not really. She stared at the ground, at the swirling patterns the wind traced in the dust, lost in a world that no one else could see. Just a few months ago, she had belonged in that world, the world of running, jumping, and especially swimming. She had lived for the water, had felt more at home in the shimmering blue depths than she ever did on land. She could still remember the way her body had sliced through the cool embrace of the pool, her muscles burning in the best way, her coach's whistle barely audible over the rush of her own heartbeat. They had called her Little Shark, the fastest swimmer on the team. Now the water was like a dream belonging to someone else. She had tried to pretend it didn't matter, tried to smile when her mother spoke in that too bright voice about new hobbies she could take up instead. But deep down, Hazel knew the truth. That life was gone, and she was trapped in this one. Her mother, Rebecca Murphy, sat on a nearby bench, watching Hazel with the cautious concern of someone afraid to speak the wrong words. She clutched her purse in her lap, knuckles white, as though holding on to something tangible would help her hold on to Hazel. Rebecca had always been the strongest person Hazel knew, but lately her mother looked fragile, like a piece of glass with tiny cracks spreading across its surface. A few feet away, Daniel Murphy, her stepfather, pretended to be busy checking his phone. He shifted his weight from one foot to the other, as if debating whether to approach. Hazel knew he was trying, but it didn't matter. No one could fix this. Then, a sudden, sharp bark shattered the air. It was loud, urgent, slicing through the peaceful chatter of the park like a warning siren. Hazel flinched, fingers tightening on her wheelchair's arms. The sound wasn't normal. It wasn't the casual bark of a playful dog. It was something else. Parents stiffened. A group of children stopped their game of tag, their heads swiveling toward the sound. A sleek black dog had appeared from nowhere. It moved with purpose, weaving through the park with startling agility, its fur gleaming in the fading sunlight. Its body was lean, powerful, more wolf than domestic pet. And then there were its eyes. They weren't brown, or even hazel. They were an unnatural, piercing blue. And they were locked onto her. Hazel's breath caught in her throat. A woman nearby gasped, pulling her child close. "Whose dog is that?" someone whispered. No one answered. The dog didn't slow. It closed the distance between them, its gaze never wavering, and then just feet away from Hazel it skidded to a stop, and barked, louder this time, sharper. It was frantic, desperate. It wasn't aggression. It was a warning. The hair on Hazel's arm stood on end. Rebecca rose from the bench, slow and careful. "Hazel, don't move," she said, her voice thin, wary. Daniel stepped forward, shoulders squared, hands flexing at his sides. "Is it dangerous?" someone murmured behind them. But Hazel wasn't afraid. Somehow she knew, deep in her bones, that this dog was not here to hurt her. Then, a deep, thunderous roar filled the air. A delivery truck, large, fast, barreled around the corner. The driver's face glowed blue from the light of his phone screen. He wasn't looking. He didn't see her. Hazel's breath hitched. Her body went rigid. There was no time to move, No time to think. Then, strong arms yanked her backward. The world tilted. Her wheelchair lurched. A loud whoosh of air rushed past as the truck thundered by, so close that Hazel could feel the wind of its passing brush against her skin. Brakes shrieked, rubber burned against asphalt. The truck skidded to a stop halfway down the street. Silence followed. Then, gasps. Someone screamed. A child burst into tears. It took Hazel a full second to realize she was still here, still alive. Daniel had pulled her away just in time. He crouched beside her now, breath ragged, his hand still gripping the wheelchair as if afraid to let go. His face was pale, his knuckles white. "Hazel!" His voice was hoarse, barely more than a whisper. "Are you okay?" Hazel didn't answer. She barely registered the truck, the bystanders, the whispers. She turned wildly, scanning the park. The dog. Where was the dog? It was gone, vanished, as if it had never been there at all. The only trace left behind was a small, weathered object lying in the dirt near where her wheelchair had been. A collar. Daniel saw it too. He reached out, lifting it carefully, his brows furrowing as he turned it over. The leather was old, cracked in places, but the metal tag remained intact. He squinted at the engraving. "Shadow," he read aloud. Then his breath hitched. Beneath the name, etched in worn but unmistakable numbers, July 15th, 2015. Hazel's breath caught in her throat. She knew that date, her birthday. Her mother went still. Rebecca had been standing a few feet away, frozen in shock. Now, she stepped forward slowly, eyes locked on the collar as if it were a ghost. Her hands trembled. Daniel looked between them, his confusion deepening. "Rebecca," he said cautiously, "do you know this dog?" She opened her mouth, then closed it. Hazel had never seen her mother look so pale. Rebecca stopped, swallowing hard. It's not possible." But her voice lacked conviction. Hazel barely heard them. Her heart pounded, her fingers gripping the armrests of her wheelchair. She was still staring at the collar, its name and date burning into her mind. The dog had saved her life, and somehow, impossibly, it had been waiting for her. Here is the expanded 1,300-word version of Part 2 of the story, ensuring smooth, engaging storytelling with deep emotions, conflict, and character development. The days after the accident blurred into weeks, then months. The world moved on, but Hazel Murphy felt like she had been left behind, frozen in time while everything else kept spinning. She used to be unstoppable. They had called her Little Shark, the pride of the Willow Creek Junior swim team. The girl who never hesitated before diving into the water, who lived for the rush of pushing her limits, who dreamed of breaking state records. Now, Hazel wanted nothing to do with the water. She hated it. She hated the smell of chlorine, the sound of splashing, the way it used to make her feel free. She hated that people still whispered her name when they passed her in the school hallways, like she was some kind of tragic story they couldn't stop retelling. She hated that her body no longer listened to her. She hated who she had become. So, Hazel did the only thing that made sense. She disappeared. Not physically, of course. She still went to school, still sat at the dinner table, still woke up every morning when her mother coaxed her out of bed. But inside, she was a shadow of herself, moving through life without really being in it. Her friends stopped trying after a while. At first, they had come to visit, bringing her cards, balloons, stories about school and swimming meets. They spoke carefully as if afraid she might break. She didn't break. She just stopped answering, stopped smiling, stopped looking at them. One by one, they drifted away, unsure of how to reach her, until the only thing left of her old life was the pile of dust-covered swimming medals hanging on her bedroom wall. A cruel reminder of what she had lost. Hazel preferred it this way. She couldn't bear the pity in their eyes. Or worse, the guilt. She knew what they were thinking. Poor Hazel. She had such a bright future. What a shame. She didn't want their sympathy. She didn't want their sadness. She wanted them to forget she had ever existed. The accident had taken more than just Hazel's ability to swim. It had broken something inside her family, too. Her mother, Rebecca, had always been strong, always the one to keep things together. But since the accident, she had become a different person. She hovered. Everywhere Hazel went, Rebecca was right there, watching, worrying. She wouldn't let Hazel out of her sight for more than a few minutes. Every step, every movement was met with some variation of, "Are you okay? Do you need help? Let me do that for you." Hazel hated it. She didn't need her mother checking her breathing every night. She didn't need her fussing over how she held her fork at dinner or watching her like a hawk every time she wheeled herself across the room. She didn't need to be protected. What she needed was to be left alone. But Rebecca didn't see it that way. She smothered Hazel with kindness, trying to fix something that couldn't be fixed. And the more she tried to keep Hazel safe, the more Hazel felt like she was trapped, not just in the wheelchair, but in her own house. Her home had become a prison. And Daniel? He was trying. Hazel could see that. But no matter how hard he tried, he wasn't her father. He never would be. And she could tell. He knew it too. Daniel had been so patient at first. He had taken time off work to help Hazel adjust, had tried everything to bring her out of her shell. "Do you want to paint?" "No." "Maybe we could go to the bookstore, get some new graphic novels." Silence. "What if we just leave me alone?" He never got angry, not once. Even when she ignored him completely, even when she refused to speak, even when she snapped at him for no reason at all, he never raised his voice. But Hazel could see it in his eyes. The hurt, the frustration, the doubt. The quiet moments where he would sit alone in the living room after another failed conversation, his head in his hands, wondering if he would ever reach her again. She heard the late-night arguments between him and Rebecca. Not shouting, never that. But the tense, exhausted whispering of two people standing on opposite sides of an invisible canyon. "She needs time, Daniel. She needs more than just time, Rebecca. What do you want me to do? Force her to be okay?" "No, I want you to stop treating her like she's fragile. Because she's not. She's shutting down, and if we don't do something, she will come back to us when she's ready." "What if she never is?" Silence. Daniel never finished that sentence, and Hazel never let them know she had heard. It had been months now, months of the same routine, school, home, silence. Nothing changed, until the night everything cracked wide open. It had started with a simple dinner. Rebecca had made Hazel's favorite meal, spaghetti with garlic bread. It used to be something she would race home from swim practice for, shoveling forkfuls into her mouth between excited stories about training. Tonight, she barely touched it. Rebecca noticed. Of course, she did. "Sweetheart, do you want something else?" Hazel didn't answer. Daniel shifted uncomfortably, looking between them. "Hazel, you should eat. You barely had anything for lunch." Still, she said nothing. Rebecca sighed, setting down her fork. "Honey, we know this is hard, but do you?" Hazel's voice was cold, sharp. Rebecca blinked. "What? Do you know what it's like to be stuck like this?" Hazel's fingers clenched around the fabric of her jeans, anger bubbling up too fast to control. "To have everyone look at you like you're broken?" "That's not how we see you," Daniel said softly. Hazel laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Really? Then why do you keep acting like I'm some fragile thing that's going to shatter?" "Because we love you!" Rebecca's voice cracked, tears threatening to spill. "Then stop pitying me." Hazel's voice rose for the first time in months, the force of it making Rebecca flinch. Daniel exhaled, rubbing his temples. "No one is pitying you, Hazel." "You don't get it," Hazel whispered. "You don't know what it's like to wake up every day and realize your life is over." The silence that followed was suffocating. Rebecca looked away, tears sliding down her cheek. Daniel's expression darkened. Not angry, just defeated. Hazel's chest heaved. The storm inside her had finally broken free, but she didn't feel better. She felt empty. She turned away from them, pushing back from the table, wheeling herself away. Rebecca whispered something, but Hazel didn't stay to hear it. She had nothing left to say, and neither did they. The black dog with the piercing blue eyes had saved her life once, but she hadn't expected to see it again. Yet, a few days after the accident at the park, there it was, waiting for her outside the school gates. She had noticed it just as the last bell rang, sitting calmly by the entrance, watching. Not begging for food, not barking or approaching anyone, just waiting. No one else seemed to pay it much attention. Most of the students were too caught up in their own conversations, pushing past in groups, laughing, chatting about homework or weekend plans. But Hazel saw it, and it saw her. For a moment she had frozen, gripping the wheels of her chair, her heart thudding against her ribs. It couldn't be the same dog. Could it? The collar. The memory flashed through her mind. Shadow, July 15th, 2015. Her birthday. The realization made her shiver, but before she could do anything, before she could blink, the dog was gone, slipping away into the trees beyond the parking lot. She didn't tell anyone, because if she did, they would tell her it wasn't real, that she was imagining things, that she was just looking for signs where there were none. But then it happened again, and again, and again. Shadow started appearing everywhere. It wasn't just school. She would see it through the window of her classroom, sitting just beyond the fence. She would catch a glimpse of it on the way home, moving like a shadow through the trees, always at a distance, never too close. And every night, just as the house grew silent and the world outside darkened, she would hear it, the soft, steady breathing just beyond her bedroom window. At first, she thought it was her imagination. But when she finally gathered the courage to look, her breath caught in her throat. Shadow was there, sitting in the backyard beneath the glow of the porch light, its blue eyes reflecting the darkness. Watching, always watching. It should have scared her. But it didn't, because somehow it felt like a guardian rather than a threat. Shadow was there when she felt like the walls were closing in. Shadow was there when the weight of everything threatened to crush her. Shadow was there when she felt like she couldn't breathe. And then, the items started appearing. The first one was a photo. She found it one morning on the seat of her wheelchair, just as she was about to leave for school. It was old, slightly curled at the edges, the colors faded with time. A man stood on one side of the frame, his arms crossed, wearing a t-shirt with a swim team logo across the chest. Next to him was a little girl, grinning as she stood in a pool, water droplets clinging to her hair. The girl looked familiar. Hazel stared at it, heart pounding. It couldn't be her. Could it? She turned the photo over, searching for a name, a date, something. But the back was blank. She looked toward the window. Shadow was there, watching. The second item appeared a few days later. It was a medal. Old, rusted, the ribbon frayed beyond recognition. But the engraving was still visible. Willow Creek Swim Meet, 2015. Hazel's stomach twisted. She remembered that competition. She had been too young to participate at the time, but she had watched it from the stands, cheering for the older kids, dreaming of the day she would be in the water competing. And yet, here it was. Why? Shadow never left clues without a reason. The third item was the one that shook her the most. It was a fragment of a letter. She found it tucked beneath the wheel of her chair, the paper crinkled, slightly torn, as if it had been ripped from a larger page. There were only a few words left, but they were enough to make her breath hitch. Hazel, remember, don't be afraid of the water. Her hands trembled. The words felt familiar, like something from a dream she couldn't quite grasp. Her pulse pounded in her ears as she turned the paper over, desperate for more. Nothing. A chill ran down her spine. She knew these items meant something. They weren't random. They were pieces of a story, pieces of a past that someone, something, wanted her to see. And the only connection between them? Shadow. Rebecca found the items before Hazel could show them to anyone. It happened one afternoon when she was cleaning Hazel's room, gathering laundry from the floor when her hand brushed against the metal. She froze. Her breath came out in a sharp gasp. Hazel, who had been reading in bed, turned just in time to see her mother's face drain of color. "Where did you get this?" Rebecca's voice was barely above a whisper. Hazel hesitated. Rebecca didn't wait for an answer. She grabbed the metal, shoving it deep into the pocket of her sweater. Hazel sat up straighter. "Mom, what are you—" Rebecca was already moving. She reached the desk, spotted the photo, and her hands shook as she picked it up. "Mom?" Hazel's voice was sharper now, edged with something close to fear. Rebecca didn't look at her. She was staring at the picture, eyes wide, her entire body tense. Then, without a word, she grabbed it too. And the letter fragment. She stuffed them into a drawer and locked it. Hazel gaped at her. "What are you doing?" she demanded. Rebecca's hands trembled as she turned back, her expression unreadable. "These things—" she started, then stopped, inhaling sharply. "Hazel, you need to leave them alone." "Why?" Hazel challenged, anger rising in her chest. Rebecca shook her head. "Because some things are better left buried." Hazel's stomach twisted. She knew her mother was hiding something important. And she had a feeling that Shadow wasn't just bringing her random pieces of the past. It was trying to tell her the truth. That night, Hazel couldn't sleep. She kept staring at the drawer where her mother had locked away the clues. Her mind raced with questions. Who was the man in the photo? Why did Shadow bring her that particular medal? And what did the letter mean? Outside, she heard it. That steady, quiet breathing. She turned her head toward the window. Shadow sat there, as it always did, watching, waiting, as if it knew Hazel had finally started to ask the right questions. She wasn't sure what scared her more. The fact that Shadow seemed to know more about her past than she did, or the fact that for the first time in months, she wanted to know the answers. Hazel couldn't shake the feeling that Shadow was leading her towards something bigger than just random memories. The items it had delivered weren't just relics of the past. They were pieces of a puzzle, fragments of a story that someone had tried to bury. And Hazel was determined to uncover it. Her mother's reaction to the photo, the medal, and the letter fragment had been too intense, too fearful. There was something she wasn't telling Hazel, something she didn't want her to know. That night, when the house was silent and the only sound was the soft whisper of the wind against the window, Hazel made a decision. She was done waiting for answers. With careful movements, she wheeled herself toward the locked drawer in her mother's room. Her hands shook as she reached into the nightstand where she knew Rebecca kept her spare keys. When the lock clicked open, Hazel barely breathed. Inside, the photo, the medal, and the letter fragment were stacked neatly together, but there was more. A folder, thick, worn at the edges, and stamped across the top in faded letters was a name that made Hazel's heart stop. Liam Carter. She didn't move. For a long moment, all she could do was stare. That name, she knew that name. It was her father's name. The father her mother had told her died years ago. The father she had no memories of. Hands trembling, she opened the folder. Inside were medical records, coaching certifications, old newspaper clippings, and letters. Letters addressed to her. Her breath caught in her throat. She picked up the first one, the paper crinkling under her fingers. To my little Hazel, if you ever read this, it means I never got the chance to tell you in person, but I need you to know, leaving was never my choice. Hazel's vision blurred. Her father hadn't abandoned her. He hadn't died when she was a baby. Everything she had been told was a lie. Her pulse pounded as she read further. Liam Carter had been a swim coach, one of the best. He had trained Olympic-level athletes, had dedicated his life to the sport, but more than that, he had spent years helping children with disabilities find their way back to the water, children just like her. Tears pricked Hazel's eyes as she flipped through photo after photo of him at swim meets, standing beside children in wheelchairs, guiding them into the pool with the same patience and care her old coach used to show her. He had never been absent from her life. Not really, because he had been helping kids like her all along. Her breath hitched as she reached the last page of the folder, a document, yellowed with time, but still legible. It was a blueprint for a swim center, a place designed specifically for children with disabilities, a facility with adaptive pools, accessible training equipment, programs to help kids overcome their fears and return to the water. It was a dream that Liam Carter had planned to build, but it had never been completed. Hazel swallowed hard. The date on the document was from 8 years ago, the same year she was born. She turned the page, scanning the last note written in her father's handwriting. "This is for Hazel. Someday I hope she'll find her way back to the water." Her fingers clenched around the paper. He had been building it for her. Her whole life had been connected to something she never even knew existed. And then, at the bottom of the folder, she found the final letter. One that made her blood turn cold. Rebecca didn't know Hazel had uncovered the truth. She had spent the entire evening in the kitchen, staring at the unopened bottle of wine on the counter, knowing she wouldn't sleep tonight. Daniel had noticed something was wrong. He always did. "You've been quiet all night," he finally said, setting his work aside. Rebecca didn't look at him. "I'm fine," Daniel exhaled, rubbing a hand over his face. "I know you don't want to talk about him," he said carefully, "but Hazel deserves to know." Rebecca's jaw clenched. "She doesn't need to know about him. He left. End of story." "That's not the story, Rebecca." She went rigid. Daniel hesitated, then reached for his briefcase. Slowly, he pulled out a document, one Hazel hadn't seen yet. Rebecca's face drained of color. "I found this while researching new swim facility grants," Daniel said. "It was buried in an old city records file." Rebecca stared at it, her throat tightening. It was another blueprint, one she recognized. Liam's plans, for the center he had been trying to build. Daniel's voice softened. "He never stopped trying to help, Rebecca. He was building this for Hazel." Her hands clenched into fists. "Why now?" she whispered. "Why is all of this coming back now?" Daniel hesitated. Then he said the one thing she didn't want to hear. "Because of Shadow." Rebecca's stomach dropped. Daniel leaned forward. "Rebecca, that dog isn't normal. It's showing Hazel pieces of the past, leading her to things she was never meant to find. That can't be a coincidence." She shook her head, refusing to believe it. But deep down, a fear she had been suppressing for years finally surfaced. Liam Carter had never truly left Hazel's life, because he had left behind his legacy. And Shadow was his last gift to his daughter. The dog had been trained for something far greater than anyone had realized, and now it was finally completing its mission. Shadow had always led Hazel to clues, pieces of a puzzle she hadn't even known she was solving. But tonight, as the dog moved silently through the darkness, its blue eyes glinting under the dim glow of the streetlights, Hazel felt different. This wasn't just another clue. This was the end of something, or the beginning. Her hands gripped the wheels of her chair as she followed Shadow down the cracked pavement. The air was cool and damp, thick with the scent of rain that had fallen earlier that evening. Her heart pounded louder with every turn, every shadowed alley they passed. She didn't need to ask where they were going. She already knew, the old swim center, the one that had been shut down years ago, the one where Liam Carter had once worked. Her father. Hazel swallowed hard as they reached the rusted chain-link fence. The no trespassing sign was still there, faded and peeling, but Shadow slipped through a gap near the bottom, pausing to look back at Hazel. It was waiting for her. Hazel's fingers trembled as she pushed her chair closer. The fence wasn't an obstacle. Daniel had modified her wheelchair so she could move over rough terrain. She maneuvered through the opening, the cool metal brushing against her arm as she entered the abandoned facility. The moment she was inside, memories rushed at her like waves. She had been here before. Not in a way she could fully remember, but in the way that places leave imprints on people. She could hear echoes of laughter, the splash of water, the faint scent of chlorine still lingering in the air despite the building's decay. And then she saw it. A small metal box, rusted at the edges, half buried near the entrance of what used to be Liam's office. Shadow padded over to it and nudged it with its nose. Hazel's breath hitched. Slowly, carefully, she reached down and pulled it free from the dirt. Her fingers shook as she lifted the lid, revealing a stack of old papers inside. The first thing she saw was a letter, the ink slightly smudged, the edges curled. Her name was written on the front. She knew this handwriting. Her throat tightened as she unfolded the letter, Liam's words staring back at her from the page. "My Hazel, if you're reading this, it means Shadow has found you. It means you're old enough to understand. I never left you because I wanted to. I left because I was afraid. Afraid I wasn't enough. Afraid I would fail you. Afraid I wouldn't be the father you deserved. But you were never a burden. You were my greatest joy, my greatest hope. I wanted to build something for you. A place where kids like you could find their way back to the water. I wanted to be better, for you. But I ran out of time, and I can only hope, when the time is right, you'll find your way back. And know that I never, not for a second, stopped loving you. With all my heart, Dad." Hazel's fingers clenched around the letter. Her chest ached. Her father hadn't abandoned her. He had loved her. He had been afraid, yes, but never of her. For so long, she had bottled up everything, every tear, every doubt, every bit of anger. She had convinced herself that she was alone, that no one had ever truly wanted her. And yet, here was proof that she had been loved all along. The dam inside her broke. Tears spilled down her cheeks, silent at first, then coming harder, faster, shaking her entire body. She clutched the letter to her chest as sobs racked through her. The first time she had let herself cry in years. The first time she let herself feel it all. She didn't hear Daniel approaching, didn't realize he was there until she felt the warmth of his hand on her shoulder. No words, no questions. Just a steady, quiet presence. And somehow, that was enough. Because for the first time in a long, long time, Hazel didn't feel alone anymore. The letter from her father had changed everything. For so long, Hazel had believed she was alone in her struggles, a forgotten child left behind by a man who never wanted her. But now, she knew the truth. Liam Carter had never abandoned her. He had been building something for her, for kids like her, for a future he had never lived to see. And now, it was up to her to finish what he started. But first, she had to face her biggest fear, the water. For months, Hazel had avoided it, had refused to even look at a swimming pool, let alone touch it. The thought of being in the water again, of feeling the weightlessness she once loved but could no longer control, had terrified her. But now, standing at the edge of the community pool, she wasn't so sure anymore. Daniel stood beside her, his hands tucked into his pockets, watching her with quiet patience. He didn't pressure her, didn't try to convince her. He just waited. Rebecca was there too, standing a little further back, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. Hazel could tell she wanted to say something, to tell her she didn't have to do this, that it was okay if she wasn't ready. But Hazel was ready, or at least she wanted to be. She glanced down at Shadow, who had taken a seat by the pool's edge, staring up at her with those piercing blue eyes. Watching, waiting. Shadow had led her here, had led her to the truth. And now, it was her turn to take the next step. Hazel gripped the arms of her wheelchair. Her heart pounded. She closed her eyes and took a deep breath. And then, she moved forward. Daniel stepped in to help her into the water, but Hazel didn't feel weak this time. She didn't feel like a burden. She felt in control. The moment the water touched her skin, something clicked. It wasn't the same as before. She wasn't the same as before. She no longer had the same power in her legs, no longer had the effortless control she once took for granted, but she was still her. Still Hazel Murphy. And for the first time since the accident, she didn't feel like she was drowning in her own body. She was floating. Free. Rebecca let out a quiet sob, covering her mouth as she watched. Daniel smiled, his eyes filled with something Hazel had never seen before. Pride. And Shadow. The dog just wagged its tail as if it had known this moment was coming all along. That moment in the pool was just the beginning. Hazel had spent so long believing that the world had taken something from her, that she had lost everything. But now, she realized that she had something to give back. The dream Liam Carter had left behind didn't have to die with him. It could live on through her, through all of them. Rebecca and Daniel had always tried to protect Hazel, to shield her from the world, but now they realized that she didn't need protection. She needed purpose. And that's when they made the decision. They were going to rebuild Liam's dream, the adaptive swim center he had once planned, the place he had wanted to create for children like Hazel. They were going to make it a reality. Daniel took the lead, diving into the blueprints Liam had left behind. But this wasn't just about following someone else's plan. It was about building something new, something even better. Daniel redesigned everything, making sure that the center would be fully accessible, a place where any child, no matter their disability, no matter their limitations, could swim. Hazel became his guide, helping him understand what kids like her needed, not just in the water, but in the world around them. Rebecca, who had spent years burying the past, finally let herself embrace it. She quit her teaching job to focus entirely on helping families navigate the struggles of disability and recovery, making sure no child ever felt as alone as Hazel once had. The community, once hesitant, began to rally around them. Old swim coaches, parents, even people who had never met Liam Carter but had heard his story. They all pitched in. And Shadow? Shadow never left Hazel's side. Through every planning session, every construction milestone, every challenge, the dog was there, watching over her, reminding her why she was doing this. When the first walls of the new center went up, Hazel ran her fingers over the name carved into the stone entrance. The Liam Carter Aquatic Center, her father's legacy, and now her own. She turned to Daniel, who was standing beside her, the blueprints rolled up under one arm. "Thank you," she said softly. Daniel hesitated, then reached out, giving her shoulder a firm, steady squeeze. "I didn't do this, Hazel," he said. "You did." She looked down at Shadow, at the dog who had changed everything, who had led her to the truth, to her past, to her future. For the first time in a long time, Hazel didn't feel like she was trapped in a story someone else had written. She was writing her own now. The grand opening of the Liam Carter Aquatic Center was more than just a ceremony. It was a testament to resilience, love, and the power of second chances. Families gathered, children laughed, and the sound of splashing water filled the air. The once abandoned dream had come to life, stronger than ever. Hazel stood near the entrance, her wheelchair beside her, watching as the first group of kids rolled up to the pool. Some were hesitant, their hands gripping the wheels of their chairs, their expressions a mix of curiosity and fear. Just like she had been. She smiled, stepping closer, feeling no fear this time. Rebecca and Daniel stood with her, their hands resting on her shoulders. A family, complete, unbroken, stronger than before. but something was missing. Hazel turned, searching for the one presence that had always been by her side. Shadow. The dog had been there through everything, guiding her, protecting her, showing her the truth. But now, he was gone. Hazel's chest tightened. She scanned the crowd, hoping to catch a glimpse of those piercing blue eyes, that familiar dark fur. Nothing. Then, as she turned toward the entrance, she saw it. Near the edge of the pool, where the wet cement had been freshly laid the night before, was a single paw print. Shadow's final mark. A lump formed in Hazel's throat. She knelt down, running her fingers gently over the impression, as if she could still feel him there. A part of her had known all along. Shadow had come for a reason. To lead her here. To bring her home. And now, his mission was complete. Tears pricked her eyes, but she smiled. Because just as Shadow had left something behind, so had she. She turned back toward the pool. Without hesitation, Hazel dove into the water, her body moving freely, the fear gone. She was home. On the other side of the pool, a movement caught her eye. A small black puppy stood at the edge, wagging its tail, a brand new collar around its neck. A single word engraved on the tag, Shadow. Hazel laughed, a deep, joyful sound. This wasn't the end of the story. It was just the beginning. At its core, this heartwarming story is about resilience, love, and the unseen bonds that guide us through life's darkest moments. It reminds us that healing isn't just about recovering what was lost, but about discovering new strengths we never knew we had. Hazel's journey is one of transformation, learning that limitations do not define a person, and that true courage is not the absence of fear, but the decision to move forward despite it. What makes this story truly special is its deep connection to dog stories that have long captured the hearts of audiences. Animals, especially dogs, have an incredible ability to sense human emotions, offering comfort and guidance in ways that words cannot. Shadow is more than just a protector. He is a bridge between past and future, carrying the weight of unspoken love and unfinished dreams. Through his quiet yet powerful presence, Hazel finds the strength to reclaim her life, proving that sometimes the greatest guardians come in unexpected forms. Beyond the emotional depth, the story highlights the importance of acceptance and family, not just the one we are born into, but the one we build through love and trust. It challenges us to see beyond disabilities and recognize the potential within every person. It also speaks to the sacrifices made out of love, showing that even when people make mistakes, what truly matters is the effort to make things right. In the end, this story is a testament to hope, second chances, and the enduring power of love. It reminds us that no matter how lost we feel, there will always be a guiding presence, sometimes in the form of a loyal companion, leading us exactly where we need to be. Share your thoughts. We'd love to hear from you. And if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you never miss another amazing story. Together, we can shine a light on the power of doing what's right. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.